Hey, are you procrastinating again? Great news! I've got a treat for you today. Today's authors are Gourab Ghoshal and Peter Holme, who are here to talk about a classic paper, a paper that they co-authored and published in PRL back in 2005. The paper, in my opinion, has a fantastic title, which serves as a kind of mini abstract. The paper is called Dynamics of Networking Agents Competing for High Centrality and Low Degree. That's exactly what the paper is about. And in the podcast, we get into it. And who are these authors? Well, today's is a highly international talk. Gourab is at Rochester University, where he's an associate professor of physics and astronomy. He has joint appointments at the departments of computer science and mathematics. He works in the field of complex systems. His research interests are in theory and applications of complex networks, and also non-equilibrium statistical physics. Is that all? No. He also is into game theory, econophysics, dynamical systems, and let's not forget the origins of life. Peter is a Swedish scientist living and working in Japan, where he is a specially appointed professor at the Institute of Innovative Research at the Tokyo Institute of Technology. His research focuses on large-scale structures in society, technology, and biology, and mostly trying to understand them as networks. But enough background. Let's get to the show.
But even Supa's wearing black. So crazy.
We need immediately to have more. We need to have more discipline about the conversation here. I can already sense that people are jockeying for the time.
You're the well. You signed off for that when you invited us, right? So
exactly.
Utter chaos.
Yes, I am.
You're the host.
I'm deeply concerned, deeply worried. Already.
T-shirt style.
Yes, it's getting out of hand. Already completely losing control of the podcast.
This is like the start of all the Ricky Gervais podcasts, right? They start talking about a particular topic and it goes on a tangent and it's just chaos at the beginning. So,
but pretty much that's my plan also for this whole thing. But I mean, right. We're gathered here across so many time zones. Whenever Peter's involved, It gets more exotic. So we're connecting the world through technology. You're putting the shirt back on. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I just assume it didn't really start yet, but
I don't know if we started. I don't know if we started. It's
I don't know. Okay. Anyway,
I can see that you're recording, but I'd advise probably cutting the first half of this off.
Okay.
I advise cutting. I mean, I think these podcasts would be a lot better if someone would edit them. I feel like I'm not really capable of producing the kind of juicy interviews that are really needed. But I'm going to try now, and I'm going to assume now that we're rolling. I'm just going to gently, turn up the music. So I recorded all of it. It might be, that it contains gems of comedy gold that we haven't seen. But we should gently and slowly get started. And as you know, in this podcast, a big part of it is that we also hear about the people. And on this call, we have some of the most exciting people, I think, in all of network science with crazy histories. I'm thinking, honestly, Gourab, I don't even know your history. So let's start with that more. I know a little bit. I remember some stuff, but I don't know how much I imagined. But mostly what I remember, Gourab, is disappointing you. That we go out for beers and then you want more party than I can handle. So I'm like, can we sit down and have a conversation? And you're like, I would like to go to somewhere that's more happening. That's my main memory.
But I think the memory is probably fueled by your sort of partying as well. I mean, it's a little bit hazy, I think. But yeah.
Tell us I
don't know. My history is fairly boring, I would say. I mean, I did my undergraduate studies in England, in theoretical physics, and pretty traditional stuff. And then from then on, I went to the University of Michigan for my PhD with the full intent of like doing specializing in theoretical high energy physics, right? String theory and that kind of business.
Yes.
But thankfully, I came to my senses, and, I just, as I was sort of messing about, going to these seminars and colloquiums, I saw a talk given by, Mark Newman. And it was profoundly strange to me because, he was essentially using methods from physics, paradigms that we know in statistical mechanics and whatnot to describe, like, I think at the time it was US elections. I was like, what the hell has this got to do with anything in physics? And then as the talk went on, I found that it aligned with the other interests that I have outside of physics, which is I've always been interested in history, anthropology, political science, and various aspects of humanities. And I thought, well, no, this seems like a nice way to indulge all my passions, as it were, which are numerous and unlimited. And that's what I kind of fell into that, right? And then that's how the journey started.
Yes.
With Mark, it was of course mostly theoretical stuff, right? So it was random graph models and network evolution models and stuff like that. And then afterwards, I decided that I would like to do something a little bit different, but it didn't quite work out. I thought of maybe changing fields completely to sort of increase my toolkit. But as it happened, I ended up with Laszlo, and that's where I met you.
Yes.
And that was a pretty fun 3 years in Boston, where I think, we did some good work and created a lot of chaos. And with Laszlo, of course, it was more applied, right? So it was definitely much more applied than what I was doing with Mark. But it was great as well. And then eventually after that, I was given a faculty offer at the University of Miami. But I don't know. I mean, for some reason, I just didn't feel like going down south. And then I did actually end up doing something very different. So I was at Harvard for about 3 years, where I was working on this thing called the origins of life, which once again was a crazy thing to me because I had no idea people think about the origins of life. And it seemed to span things like the RNA world all the way to sort of exoplanets. And so that seemed like a fun thing to add and work on.
Yes.
And so I did that for 3 years. And then eventually I ended up here in Rochester, where now I do all those things that I have experienced, since
I've seen that all different topics come out from your work for sure. But if we go back, just because I'm curious, because I remember you as a super exactly theoretical guy. So what kind of physics did you study? Like, were you kind of in this, you want to be high energy? You were enamored with the beauty of math before you came?
I mean, I was with this whole Feynman business, right? I mean, everyone is it's pretty pedestrian. It's almost like, everyone has the same stories. Like, yeah, I saw Dick Feynman give a talk and my God, this guy's so cool. I want to be just like him, right? So that was pretty much it. But I mean, it was fun. I think what really got me into it was quantum mechanics.
Yes.
Because I found that quite strange and profound and bizarre.
Yes.
And it was a different way of thinking than what we learn in first year physics, which is this really boring and dull stuff, parabolic trajectories and balls rolling down planes and who cares, right?
I think the most boring thing, just to be clear, in my opinion, has to do with the friction stuff. All of the stuff about heat is friction. I feel like if you want to kill the joy of physics, you just tell some people, let's do some math on friction. I mean,
on the other hand,
the molecular stuff is
But on the other hand, if you have the patience to wait for 3 more years and you start doing statistical mechanics and you look at friction in terms of the fluctuation dissipation theorem, right?
Yeah, sure.
And that's more sexy and cool, right? So
absolutely.
So that's it. It's not like I have some profound relationship with math. Actually, I don't even like math most of it, but yeah, I mean, it was a cool way to sort of translate some of these ideas into things that are practical, right? Having said that, I'm lazy right now, so I don't do any calculations anymore. I just direct my students to do stuff, and I just preside.
Let's come back to that. Because as you know, I'm a terrible podcaster, and so I'm going to try and remember this because I want to also come back to because the paper we'll be talking about is about ranking. And a lot of the stuff you did also with Laszlo was all about ranking in networks. So we're going to come back But we also have another guest. It's Petter, and you're coming to us from a completely different time zone, right? So for me, it's 4 in the afternoon. For you, Gourab, it's somewhere in the morning. And what time is it where you are, Petter?
Well, yeah, I'm in Tokyo, so it's 11 p.m.
Yes.
And yeah, I'm getting used to this. I mean, sometimes I get up at 4 a.m., so
I can't
it's
believe
pretty good.
I mean, for me, just staying up to 11, I don't do that anymore. I just get to bed early, and but let's also talk about your history, because that is for sure one of the more unusual. You didn't even start studying physics, is that right? You studied, was it Chinese?
Well,
Or what's the?
yeah, I have a master's degree in Chinese, but I started studying engineering, and then I kind of switched to Chinese, and then back again to engineering. It's a mess, but we can. It's like starting from like a PhD
Yes.
program. I think my story is a little bit similar to Gourab.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's maybe the big difference is that I didn't start physics because I had some kind of really passion drive. It was more like I wanted to live in this town in northern Sweden, and I didn't have anything else to do than go to grad school. I would rather kind of make money on some kind of startup or whatever, but I didn't.
I like it.
Didn't figure that out. Yeah. So at that time I was more into math, like discrete math, but I couldn't get into the grad school program or PhD program in math. So instead I got started in physics, in statistical physics, and I was pretty bored at the time. Like I like the kind of like everyday problem solving, like related to like phase transitions and so on. But I didn't like the fact that I couldn't like chat to anyone about my work. So I was thinking of dropping out actually after a few years. But that was around the time when say scale-free networks and small world networks became a hot topic among physicists.
Yes.
So this also tells you that I'm a few years older than Gourab.
Oh. You cannot tell. I mean, you look just unbelievable. I have to say.
Oh yeah, sure.
I mean, he hasn't changed one bit since I saw him in 2005. I think. Yeah, it looks
that's what I wanted to say about you. And then, I mean, you look young at that time anyway. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, so I mean, like scale-free networks saved my life in a way, like in my academic life. So when I started studying networks, so I could write a thesis about networks, I was kind of hooked on academic science and been doing that ever since.
But I think like you wrote can I just ask a question? You wrote a paper on scale-free networks with clustering, which is you just grow the network with triangles, basically. And I still see people using that when because it's kind of sometimes you need a scale-free network with some triangles in it. And so they find this paper. So when in the process was that?
I mean, what happened was like 2 years into my PhD program, we started some kind of reading group, me and a postdoc at the time, Bom Jung Kim, who later became my advisor because he got a faculty position there.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had this reading group, and we're just kind of like trying to play around and trying to kind of code up the models, like the Barabasi-Albert model, for example. And I think it was kind of an open question at the time, how to get kind of like control the clustering, because those were the two cool things at the time, like clustering and the scale-free degree distribution.
Yes.
So we combined that and wrote a paper. I think that was extremely quick process. Everything like from beginning of coding to publication was like 2 months or 3 months. And
yes, you don't see that so often. But okay, so now we have you in northern Sweden taking a PhD. Then you were also in Copenhagen at some stage, and you were
that's
also in
right.
Michigan. So how do we get you through?
Okay. Yeah, so I got to spend the last year of my PhD program in Copenhagen because the kind of godfather of statistical physics in Umeå, he became a director of Nordita, the institute in Copenhagen at that time. So that was my last year of PhD. Then I decided to kind of do something like career smart, because I had never done that up to that point in my life, and I never done it after either. So I went to Michigan because Mark Newman was my like a great idol at the time, and yeah, that's where I met Gourab too.
So. See, the stories are converging. This is amazing.
Yeah, they're converging and diverging, but maybe we don't have to go there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, in a way, I want to spend the whole podcast on just going into the like your backstories. But I guess maybe we can already begin to get to the paper, and then we can kind of loop back around. But first, Gourab, this is about ranking, and all the stuff I remember you working on when we were kind of working together was also ranking. So is this the seed of your work on ranking for that period, or because it happened chronologically before you came to Laszlo's group, this paper, right?
Yeah, I mean, they are related, but it's not so much in terms of ranking, in terms of the idea of centralities, right? So the paper that we will talk about is one flavor of centrality, whereas the paper that I did with Laszlo was essentially on the stability of PageRank, right? Like the question was like, why is it that PageRank works as well as it does?
Yes.
And then we went through this whole sequence of arguments to show that the reason why PageRank works is because of the structure of the things that it's ranking, right? Yeah. And I guess then it led to some other stuff about some dynamical ranking processes, which work with remember Nick Bloom and Ginestra and people like that. I think they are related in some sense, but I think, in terms of, I wouldn't say there was any particular inspiration or anything connecting the two papers.
No. All right. Makes sense. Fair enough. But let's talk about this paper. And I also, since one of the things that's kind of driving my curiosity is also that papers are always presented as these pristine, beautiful things devoid of any backstory. You just thought, here's an idea and this is what we found, and then that's the paper. But at least some papers, I know, Peter, you read very old papers and stuff, so maybe it's not all papers, but a lot of papers. But here I would also like to go back and kind of get the story of how the paper and the ideas for the paper come out of other things, maybe other papers you worked on, right? Like the clustering and scale-free paper came from saying those are the two cool things, so let's try and combine them. So we have both of you now in Michigan in 2005, I assume. And how does this paper come about? I don't know who wants to take the lead on this one.
Yeah, I mean, we tried to reconstruct it. I mean, we had a chat like a few weeks ago. Yeah, I don't know if we ever could figure out like the chain of events that led up to it. More than it was probably happening in some bar somewhere.
Yes,
but like this paper is a kind of combination of like different ideas. I mean, maybe we should kind of first say the kind of basic outline of the paper. Or the idea. So it's like a toy model of a social system where agents try to solve a problem. So they try to be central in a network, but they also try to keep the degree low. So they're kind of like trying to optimize two conflicting things, because usually degree and centrality is correlated.
Yes.
And they do that also by kind of detaching and attaching to neighbors locally. So they cannot see the entire network. They can only see like 2 steps away. and take action in this kind of extended neighborhood of the nodes. And then the strategy is encoded in a vector that is updated by some kind of genetic algorithm type of mechanism. So I guess, I mean, this kind of combine a few ideas at that time. Like one thing is this idea that you can kind of encode like the status of agents by their network position. So by the kind of degree and the centrality. That was something I was into those days. And then, I mean, also this adaptive network idea that the network kind of evolves along with the structure evolves along with some kind of like dynamics on top of the network.
Yeah.
That was popular. There was a paper by Zimmerman and Egulus that I was a bit inspired by.
But so,
I mean, there were like essentially two themes that we're trying to solve here, right? So, I mean, the way that we kind of framed it was like, you know, in a later subsequent publication in a book chapter, we call it the diplomat's dilemma, right? So essentially you are someone who wants to leverage your position in trying to make the most efficient contacts as possible. So obviously the trivial way to make that particular contact is to connect to everybody, but you know that we have finite resources and finite time. And therefore what you want to do is you want to be smart about this. Like, how is it that I can influence a network by connecting to the right people by having minimum resource cost, right? So these are the sort of two competing sort of themes. And the other thing, as Peter said, is like, you know, at the time, everyone was looking at the structure of networks, right? Structural properties and everything. And then you had, you know, I would say comparatively limited investigation on, say, the pure dynamics on networks, which of course picked up. You know, we're talking about 15, 20 years ago now almost. I believe that's far away. But then there was this new thing, as Peter said, like, you know, with the paper by Zimmerman and Egulus, and also like, you know, Hiroki Sayama and Thibaut Gross were also interested in this, is the co-evolution of the network topology and the dynamics that evolves in the network itself, right? So how does like one influence the other? So, you know, something is happening on network as a response to that, the connections change, and then that changes the dynamics as well, right?
Yes.
So this was something which I don't think many people were looking at the time. So I think so that's what it was. And as far as I remember, so Peter was already interested in this, and he kind of approached me and we started discussing this when we were both at the Santa Fe Institute, the summer school, right? So we already wrote something together very quickly when when we were in Michigan. Then he went to SFI for the summer school, and that was a pretty cool environment. I mean, for those who've been there. And so I think we kind of like, you know, thrashed out most of the ideas, like, you know, in the, I don't know, it was the El Farol bar or like on hikes, like, you know, and sort of like the canteen mess, and then while playing like, you know, playing snooker or pool, you know, that's pretty much where the details of this sort of came to play, right? I mean, it was a lot of messing around at the beginning. We're just trying all kinds of different ideas until we sort of got to this point. So as you said, it's not like we had some clear idea. It's like, yeah, this is exactly how the paper is going to come out. It was just like the two of us essentially having fun. We thought it'd be a cool topic to work on, and then it just evolved organically.
Yeah, no, but I think it is super interesting, and it is interesting. It is kind of an art form, I guess, also to find, like you say, you have these opposing mechanisms, and you have to find constraints that make it so that they don't just run to some corner and optimize something, but that interesting dynamics take place, and that, you know, that something actually happens on this network. And so I think, you know, there's some different directions we can take in discussing this. I think it's interesting to think about, you know, how do you find models of this type that behave like this? Do you just try a bunch of different stuff, or is it more theory driven? But I think before we do that, let's talk more about the paper. So it makes sense it came about like this, but maybe you could also then now go to just the area of, so you have these diplomats, they're trying to be central, and they're trying to keep their degree low. And so we kind of go, I'm beginning to think like, well, how would I do that? How would, if I were in a network, or what kind of network structures facilitate that some nodes really win at this? So maybe we can start by saying, okay, so now you set it up, what kind of behaviors do you see in the network, Peter? Like what do the nodes do? to be good diplomats?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually, they do a bit of everything, and that's kind of both kind of the good and bad thing here. So it actually, the dynamics will be very complicated. So it will kind of be like transitions between like different strategies being the best, and this is accompanied by the changes in the structure of the network itself.
Yeah.
So in a way, I mean, you can argue like, I mean, look at the diplomats of the world. Does their social network look like that? And the answer is probably no.
Sure.
Which is, but this is a bit like the zeitgeist of 15 years ago. Like simple rules gives complex behavior. That was a very hot topic at the time.
Yeah.
And maybe not so much anymore. Like I think if we would do it again, we would maybe try to kind of find some verifiable result. But still, I think it's.
But
I mean, I would say that you know, like what was interesting about this particular paper is that we were almost very naive in terms of how we decided like how one would optimize their position, but the dynamics was extremely complicated. Like one of the things that was cool about this is that, you know, everyone is looking at the thermodynamic limit, right? The asymptotic limit of large graphs when n goes to infinity, and then you have all these convergent behaviors. So we looked at relatively smaller systems. And of course, the other thing was there was a finite horizon problem, which means that, okay, so I mean, the essential idea is this, that I am a diplomat, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the best practices of my neighborhood, right? So, you know, but my neighborhood is limited. So I can only see my friends and their friends' friends. And then I update who I connect to or who I drop links with based on the performance of my neighborhood, right? So if I see a particular diplomat doing particularly well, then it makes sense that I would connect to that person. Whereas if I see somebody who's not really doing anything, then I am wasting my resources on talking to that particular person. So, I mean, there was a strategy, there was a vector which encodes all these simple strategies. You add a link, delete a link to the best performing person, the worst performing person. You know, there was like some noise in the system, so you make the process ergodic, et cetera, et cetera. But the thing is that it never converged to like a fixed topology, right? So there were these intermittent bursts of certain strategies being adopted and certain strategies sort of going away. The network would have all kinds of different topologies, you know, some, it would be approaching a star graph, for example, which is obviously the optimal topology for this, but then it would break away and look at something else. And yeah, so I mean, sort of the degree distribution as such was not the most interesting aspect of it. The interesting aspect of it is never reached equilibrium, right? And the other thing was that people had to constantly update their strategies to keep on performing well. And this is something that you see in evolutionary biology, right? That's called the Red Queen effect from Alice in Wonderland. So unless, you know, you have to follow the Red Queen. If you don't follow the Red Queen, you sort of get doomed. So if you are particularly passive, then you're done for. So you have to constantly sort of like, you know, update, right? So it's a very, very simple model, right? But it captured a very complex set of dynamics. And the dynamics, again, was evolving as a function of the topology, which was constantly changing. It never converged to anything, right? So I thought that was particularly interesting about this. The topology is not, I think, the key thing here, or what the distribution of links are, but I think it does actually mimic the behaviors of what you see in the real world, right? That you have to constantly adapt around, you have to constantly update your information. If you're a laggard, you just fall behind and you die, right? You know, we were just talking about this, Peter and I, a couple of weeks ago. It in some sense is almost like an early version of reinforcement learning, because everyone likes machine learning these days, right? Use your generative adversarial networks, your convolutional neural nets, whatever, right? Or random forests. So in some sense, it was a very simple version of reinforcement learning. You have to constantly sort of like learn from your neighborhood such that you evolve, adapt, and survive.
Yes, but if I can just say, so I like this Red Queen where you have to keep moving to stand still, right? Is what's going on with her, and but I'm still, I like this idea that the network, I mean, somehow is the network changes, and then you have to adapt your strategy. Then you adapt your strategy that causes the network to change. And then since the network's now changed, you have to adapt your strategy. But what you're saying, I think, is that we don't have like a super strong like it's not so interesting what happens in the network. It's not that it becomes assortative and then disassortative or anything like that, or you didn't measure it.
I mean, it goes through all those phases essentially, right? So, but none of those phases are stable, is the point.
Yes, because
sometimes it's very dense, and sometimes it's super sparse. That's also kind of funky. I mean, I don't know any other network evolution model that has the kind of density fluctuations like that.
No. Yeah. And it's also very interesting in terms of, making predictions, coming back to this as an analogy for machine learning, because we also know that in systems, like there's in economics, there's this thing that you can now, let's assume that you can predict the economy, you make an algorithm that predicts the economy, then you make it public, and as everyone knows what the economy is doing, then they start acting on it, and then the model becomes invalid. So I guess it's a similar effect here, that as the good strategy becomes known, it stops being the good strategy.
Yeah, I think there is that effect too. Plus the agents here have a very short memory. So I mean, it keeps changing for that reason all the time.
But can you expand on the reinforcement learning a little bit? Because reinforcement learning, I guess in my mind, still converges to something.
Oh no, I mean, the analogy is loose. It's not the exact same thing, right? So it'll be interesting to see if there is indeed a convergence in like the infinite graph size limit, right? At the asymptotic limit. Because you got to keep in mind that also like we were dealing with like finite graphs, right? Where fluctuations persist. I mean, although we did some, I think I don't remember exactly, can remember better, but we did some studies on scaling with system size in terms of how things changed. And surprisingly, it didn't seem to converge to something. I mean, I guess the behavior was more or less stable.
I don't remember the.
Yeah. That's something you should probably. Yeah.
I mean, we have some figure in the paper. I think the last figure is some like a finite size scaling thing, but we didn't kind of extrapolate to infinite system size. That was not the thing.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think this point that you made, which I didn't quite consider, I think that's a nice connection in terms of, I guess in the stock markets, right? I mean, you have some momentary advantage and arbitrage when you're trying to sort of like do these call options on short, on stocks, and then sort of like, but as enough people adopt that option is not optimal, right? It just converges to its equilibrium value or whatever it is. So I think, so I think that there is some overall philosophical underpinnings of this. Like, you have some short temporal window in which like you have some optimal strategy, but as the crowd begins to learn about that strategy, that goes away, then you have to readapt once again.
Yeah. But I also think that I'm almost kind of, I want to know what's a good strategy to be central with a low degree. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think it's also an interesting question. So of course it's only a meaningful question given some graph structure. And so it becomes very loopy when you then have this ability to also reconfigure yourself. But it is an interesting question. It's almost a shame that the strategies aren't more interpretable, right? Because it would be really interesting to know.
No, I mean, actually, it is in some sense, because it's by far the strategy, though metastable, but the most dominant was mimicry, which is like copy the best performing neighbor, right? So it's almost like saying learn from best practices. I think, I suppose it's like the best strategy. But the interesting thing is that doesn't always work. That even if you learn from the best practices, there can be shocks to the system such that, even that fails at some point. Yes. I think in some sense, that's a lot more realistic to what happens in the real world, right? I mean, sort of nothing in the world is like pure and pristine and like, sort of follow every single prediction you make. It's messy, it's noisy. And I think that in some sense, even though this model is simple, it captures reality more than I think some of the more pristine kind of models in some sense. So,
sure. I mean, it's hard to gauge, I guess, but I can totally see that if you want to be central, you connect to the most central person you know. And then once you know them, you look around and you say, who is now the most central person I know? And then you play a catch up with that, right? It makes sense. That's a good strategy. But then I guess my question is, what then happens in your model when that strategy fails, or what happens to make that fail? Do you have an intuition for that?
I mean, you can see some like configuration and reason about them. So like one thing that kind of appears many times is like a type of star graph, as Gourab already said. Like,
yeah.
So there are like two nodes with like extremely high degree connecting to almost every other node, and then almost every other node is have like very low degree.
Yeah.
So of course the hubs in that system, they are kind of punished by the high degree, and the periphery is punished by the low centrality. So they are kind of all performing roughly equally well. And then, I mean, you can keep thinking of, I mean, I guess the periphery nodes would kind of maybe mimic the hubs on whatever they do for the next time step, but then you can kind of reason about like what's going to happen in the next step. But I actually forgot really how it goes there.
I mean, I think it's that small fluctuations in the system can sort of really make things awry, because like one of the interesting things that we saw was you had these periods where the dominant strategy was mimicry, right, of the best performing neighborhood. And then you would have a period where sort of like the dominant strategy was just making random connections, right?
Yeah.
And you can think of a situation where one of your neighbors, just by making a random connection, just happens to find the right person, right? And then as you scan your neighborhood, you find that the best performing person is not the one who is connecting to the highest person, but it's the one that just did this random strategy. So then you adopt a random strategy, and then you can have a cascading effect. But of course, we know that that's not our optimal strategy. So then the network takes some time to learn the fact that this is not the best strategy, and then recovers and goes back to what works, right? So it's like small changes in the system can sort of like really derail things, I think so.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, but I think it's super cool, and I agree with you that, you know, that this is, it seems that it's a kind of early mover in this kind of co-evolution network space. But then, Peter, you had this interesting comment that I always also get at, which is, you know, you made this at the Santa Fe Institute. The Santa Fe Institute is all about simple models leading to complex behaviors. And I think it's fair to say that there was some kind of enthusiasm about, you know, even the scale-free model, you could say was this, at the time, we thought we have a simple model and it can reproduce this scale-free behavior that seemed at the time to be very rare. And so there's so much attention going there to this kind of simple model area, and we could solve some of these and write down nice equations, as you say, for the infinite limit or some kind of steady state. But the interesting thing that's happened later is that we found out that actually we can put together lots of models that give us power laws. And it seems that there are many models that we can put together that gives us some kind of complex behavior. So the kind of profundity, I think that's the word, right? That's right. Better than profoundness, which was my other, but the profundity of those is called into question a little bit. And you were suggesting that, I think, Peter, and that's why now maybe models have to be a little bit more close to data. Do you have any thoughts like on where are we now, or how would you do? Let's say that you're coming back to this paper, a classic, PRL, and now I made you work on this. Where would you take it, knowing that, you know, these models are, because I think there is something for sure, but how do we make it modern, or how does it relate to what the world is like now? I know it's an impossible question, but sorry.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I think it's a paper. It's kind of in the spirit of the time. I mean, in this transition from like the Santa Fe Institute in the 90s with the self-organized criticality and the kind of the idea of universality being like a very big and important thing, to like today's kind of data science. We already mentioned the kind of this reinforcement learning aspect. So that's maybe like another kind of bridge to the present. But of course, if you want to do something nowadays, I think it would be much higher impact if you have some data to verify it. Of course, it would have been back then too. But I mean, the emphasis is more on data. But at the same time, it's a kind of like this kind of social simulation and like simulation, toy model simulation of social system to understand like mechanisms. I think that is a very important type of computational social science that's kind of a bit forgotten now in this era of the kind of like big data.
I mean, I would say that, sorry to interrupt there, but I would say that, I think both approaches are necessary. And as Peter is saying, like one of them is perhaps being a little bit forgotten, because a problem with trying to get everything out of data, right, is that you're really sort of looking at trends. And it's then very, very difficult to provide any mechanism behind what those trends are, right? So, I mean, that's really sort of what you get from machine learning. In machine learning, essentially, you're getting trends. It doesn't provide you any answers as to like what the dynamical process is that led to that trend. Now, the question is, how would you model all the degrees of freedom or all the complexities inherent in this data, like, with a single model, right? I mean, that's also kind of tough because it has so many different components and it's so complex. It's very hard to say which of these components are really influencing what the outcome is, right?
Yes.
So there is a space then to sort of like, as physicists, we do the spherical cow thing, right? It's to like boil it down to its very essence, make some educated guesses as to what might be that's driving this, and then write down some toy models or equations, and then that has some specific predictions. The majority of those predictions don't work, but some of them do, right? So there is some essence of truth there. And then one can go back to the data and then slowly build up some of the components to try and get closer and closer to what reality is, right? If we were to do this today, I think I guess we can use whatever the things that we have learned over the last 10 years on this. But rather than looking for data out there, what I personally would do is perhaps run an experiment, right? So recruit some people, just like you guys did with the amazing experiment you did with the smartphones, right, in the campus.
Yes.
And then, assign some rules and then just see how the thing evolves, because you have some controls over there as well, right? The problem with data is you don't have much controls. I mean, it incorporates everything. So it's very, very hard to say like which aspect of what your guess is really influencing things. So maybe like an actual experiment, involving real people in some real world setting would be the way to check these ideas.
Yes, I think that's a really nice idea. I mean, I'm reminded about what, like what it used to be to write a paper would be to you have a model for the process, and then you pick a parameter that you care about. Let's say the degree distribution, and then you find an empirical system and you plot the degree distribution, and then you tune your system so that you match this distribution of the parameter you care about, right? Like that was kind of the classic matching distribution. And I think that that's somehow not enough. You have to somehow match some covariates or interactions or something, right? I think there is something to there's something somehow that you want to capture in the structure of the data. But I agree with both of you that it's really important like on my computer, it's going nuts because my kids are using the Apple TV. So it's like it's a big notification coming in about, so I'm getting sidetracked here. I apologize, guys. But I think this coevolution stuff is important. And I think, what you're also talking about is another name for it would be mechanistic models, right? That's like the difference between the machine learning, that we don't just want to fit behavior, but we want to understand mechanisms. And that's what this kind of way of modeling allows us to do. And I think, to me, the thing that really is interesting is how the network change, because real networks change also from local information, right? Like when we make decisions on networks, or when components of a cell decides, where to interact with, it's based on more or less local information. Of course, it can be some kind of overall field saying like, now it's hot, so you should prioritize this or that. So there is some kind of global information, but a lot of it is local. And I like this idea that we want the network structures, even the interesting global ones, to come from local decisions. And you're right that there's not so much work on that, I guess. Sorry. This is more a comment than a question, as they say in the talks.
Yeah, right. I guess so. I guess, yeah. It's very difficult to say if there is any work on it or not, simply because of the volume of stuff that comes out these days, right?
Yes.
But yeah, it certainly is not at the mainstream. I would say that, because I bet, and we haven't checked this, but I bet that we would get complete convergence to a stable structure if we increase the horizon of the neighborhood, right? So instead of knowing your neighbors and next nearest neighbors, you also know your third nearest neighbors and your fourth nearest neighbors until you get to the graph diameter. And then everyone has complete information about the network. And I bet you it's going to converge to like some star graph or something without any change, right? So I think it's the local information that's really sort of driving the interesting dynamics. I think, and Petter, I think, has evangelized about this in his postings, right? That sometimes studying small systems locally is fun and has some very interesting, behaviors, and could be more relevant than looking at the entire thing, right? So then looking at so-called these infinite graph kind of limit stuff. Maybe that was your inspiration for the whole temporal network business as well. So
yeah, maybe something like that.
Yeah.
But I think one good point with this model is that it is like a mechanistic model, but the point is not to show universality. So it's more like to connect and reason about like different, in this case, to like conflicting optimization goals, right? So that's something we could maybe take from this and continue working on.
Yeah, and I also think this whole notion of adaptive networks where the dynamics and the topologies co-evolve, somehow that hasn't really received much attention, right? I think it's sort of, I don't see too many papers on that. Again, I want to be careful because I can't read every single paper on the planet, but at least I haven't seen that. And I think it kind of reached its, is it what, apex? Yeah, apex, I guess, or nadir. I'm confusing the two. It reached its apex with, with this book that came out, edited by Thilo Gross and Hiroki Sayama. And then Thilo Gross did some interesting work on this in terms of what he called like equation-free models, right? In terms of like describing these systems, because, it's not just society, but, adaptive network. I mean, everything's an adaptive network, right? The human brain is an adaptive network. The neurons reconfigure based on signaling. Traffic, for example, if you have congestion in some part of a highway, then, things get, you can alleviate that congestion by building a side street, right? So the topology has now changed. The dynamics of traffic has changed, of course, on different time scales. But this is something which really is applicable everywhere. But I don't think it has reached, it hasn't received that much attention. I could be wrong. But it's something, if you're going towards realism, then it's something that we should be focusing on.
But I think the question then remains still, how do we choose which of the myriad possible models are the right ones? Because I think that, just like Game of Life, or read any Wolfram book and look at the cellular automata, and you see that for so many of the models, simple interaction patterns give us complex global behavior. So I think the reason we get stuck, and I might be wrong, but isn't it because we don't know, it's a difficult to set up and say, look, this one does something interesting. It's like the red queen effect. And, you know, and if you can solve the equations, you can put a paper in PRL. But the question is to say, but how do we somehow show that this tells us something important about the world, and it's not just a cute mathematical model? That's why it's hard to move onwards, right?
Yeah, but in some sense, that's true for all models, right? I mean, sort of, there's this quote that I think that all models were wrong, but some are deadly. So I think, I mean,
it's a nice one. I hadn't heard that formulation. Oh, can I remember one that I heard the other day from my father-in-law, and he said, this is a good one too. We'll get back on track. He said, statistics is like a street lamp. It's not very enlightening, but it's good to lean up against if you're feeling confused.
That's a good one. Yeah,
that's not bad at all.
Yeah, and quite relevant in the situation that we are in right now.
Yes. So, anyway, sorry for that.
But they're like mechanistic models. Like another purpose of them is like they can work as proof of concept models. So meaning that you have some ideas of how a system works, and you want to kind of to explain some behavior. Then you want to see that like putting them together actually reaches that goal, can perform that kind of explanation. I think that is a very valuable thing.
But I think I would say, like, you know, from a practical point of view, right? Like, how do you know if a model is wrong, or right or wrong, right? So I think that, of course, every model has some prediction. Just as you said right now, like, you know, the what we were doing before is like, you know, we picked one such facet, the distribution of links, right? Degree distribution. And we had some generative model that produces that distribution, but it doesn't predict anything else, right? It gets the clustering wrong, or it gets assortivity wrong. It gets high order structures wrong, right? So obviously, to know if a model is really, you know, the correct one, which of these myriad ones sort of, you know, is the right one to use for reality, part of it depends on the question you're asking, but part of it is also that, you know, a good model would predict more than just one facet, right? So if you're really getting the mechanisms right, it should not just be the distribution of links, but it should be like, you know, as you said, assortivity, disassortivity, you know, levels of clustering, you know, whatever other features you pick. So I think that's what distinguishes between them, right? So are we there yet? I don't think so. I don't think we have like some universal model that explains, you know, all these possible interactions. And in some sense, it's also pretty hard, right? Because, you know, we're talking about things which is, if you want to like talk it from a physics point of view, it's like mesoscopic physics. Like it's macroscopic physics, it's not microscopic physics, it's mesoscopic physics. And it's basically people, right? Who are very, very complicated. In practically every single model we have, the one missing component which throws the spanner in the works and which gets everything wrong is the concept of human behavior. No one has figured out a good way to actually model human behavior. You can do it at the population level where all the behaviors average out to some, you know, some whatever, the fluctuations dissipate. But at the individual level, it's practically impossible, which is why, you know, people have been doing this for, you know, we just started, you know, as physicists, we just walked in the, you know, the bar and just said like, hey, we're going to tackle all these problems. People have been thinking about this for hundreds of years, right? I mean, social scientists, economists and stuff like that. And nobody's quite solved that problem. So it's very, very hard to really model these things as a challenge. And it's very, very hard to say which one is right. And we don't have these simple arguments that we have in, let's say, in physical systems, like, oh, dimensionality or symmetries, you know, which make things easier, right? It's a much more messy problem.
But so of course, I agree that the more stuff, first of all, I think it's a very high bar to say that a model should explain what the world is. But what I want to kind of get at with these models is how can we even be sure that they explain anything about the world? Like how can, like, even let's say that we build a nice little model and it matches two different quite distinct behaviors, and we like the mechanisms. We say like they sound like you know, like there's some, let's say there's some fitness, and we like it, we like everything about it. But I think the fundamental problem is still to say, but how can we be sure that this model teaches us anything, or that it's not another one that's the right one. And I understand that, like, this is the whole point of all models are like, this is science. It can only be falsified. But what is the argument still? I guess maybe there is no more. Just to say that, yeah, it explains the data. Maybe that's the only thing.
Well, I would add to that, right? So let's say that you have a model which explains the data, but it also makes a prediction that you haven't seen the data do yet.
Yeah, for sure.
And then you go look, and in the future, you see that actually comes to pass.
Yes.
Right? Let's say that you are modeling the US stock market, right? And the best models, like, efficient market hypothesis, all that kind of stuff, would get you to 2008. But then if you had a model which sort of took into account the fact that, that tail risk is distributed according to a heavy tail distribution and not Gaussian, then your model would probably pick the fact that there was going to be a crash in 2008, right? So I think, so that's how you learn, because, you might have a model which might be explaining everything very well right now, but it's just missing an aspect that's hidden in the system.
Yes.
So that's one possibility, I would say.
That makes sense.
Yeah, you can go into detail and kind of look at the kind of component of a mechanistic models and kind of measure them explicitly. I mean, if it's like about if it involves human behavior, you can maybe measure that in a lab. That would be some like correlation study or something.
Yeah.
I think that, you would have to validate them kind of in many different ways if you want to make sure they're really kind of reflecting reality. But you can also kind of argue that is that the really the goal of modeling, or if in a kind of like freer kind of thinking, models can kind of serve to kind of build hypotheses for other types of scientific investigations.
Yes.
And help you think about the system in different ways.
Yeah.
Not necessarily being like true models.
I totally agree that the purpose of models can be many, many different things, and some of them are just to aid our thinking. It's just to say, like, if we combine this element, like, if we combine, that's in a very pure form what you're doing. You're saying what kind of networks come out if you want to be central, yet you don't want to make too many connections, right? Like this is something that we could sit and argue about over a beer, and we could come with some arguments. But at the end of the day, it's such a complex thing when you think about the interplay with all the nodes and the network and all these things. And indeed, that's also what you find, that when you mix it up, you find this crazy fluctuating, non-converging behavior. So that's a good point.
It's a kind of modeling that we need too. And like many of the big problems in the world are like, say COVID or global warming. These are things that where we cannot learn from the past because it never happened before. We cannot rely on like machine learning there. We have to kind of think about mechanisms, and like these mechanistic models can kind of connect mechanisms, and that will be the best answer we have for those questions.
So this brings me to another question I had lying around in the back of my head, which is, so you had this kind of non-converging behavior that's changing. And Petter, you did so much work, the COVID reminded me of it, on epidemics and processes on temporal networks. So there is a sound to it that's kind of like an endemic disease almost, right? That you have this behavior that it never goes somewhere. Is there like some kind of similarity there, or is it far-fetched?
I guess it's a bit far-fetched.
All right, fair enough.
Somehow, yeah, like epidemic models are much more well-behaved than this.
Yes.
And then another thing is like we usually like kind of take the contact structure as kind of fixed or kind of given by other social processes, which is actually not kind of realistic. And you would rather have like a adaptive network where people kind of change their behavior because of awareness and so on. Of course, there are such models too around, but yeah, I lost the thread here a bit.
No, I mean, we started from a stupid question, so I think it's fair that you. I think it's fair that you lose the thread. But I think this is awesome, and I mean, I could honestly go on discussing models for a long time because I think it's somehow completely not appreciated by the public how different models are, right? And how if you just think it, I just remember in COVID times, you know, like some people make these models that are very focused on making accurate predictions and they throw so much information in, and then someone else says, well, what if we put super spreading in an SIR model and see how that changes things? And then they write a paper about it and people are like, well, it's the same thing, right? And I really think this metaphor that you can't, and machine learning once again is something completely different, but it's also a mathematical model, right? So models serve so many purposes, from teasing out mechanisms to making accurate predictions to, yeah, I mean, we covered it all. I won't repeat it, but I think it's.
I mean, COVID is a great example, right? Because I mean, as you mentioned, like there was a lot of work done in trying to, especially in the early days when things were in full-blown panic, forecasting. And there was a problem of severe overestimates, severe underestimates, and then there were all kinds of different models that came around, each with their peculiarities, and it's tough, right? I mean, it's the public went mad, but as expected, because it obviously wasn't the news cycle. But it's hard to appreciate just how complicated these choices one has to make in devising such models, right? So prediction forecasting is always challenging, right? As I say, like prediction is hard, especially of the future. So, but you can turn this question around and say, which we've been doing some work, is that what makes a system vulnerable to the spread of such pandemics in the first place? And that's a completely different kind of question, a different kind of model that you're asking. So you're not so worried so much about all the vagaries that's going into, say, real-time forecasting and saying, okay, if I look at a structure of a city, if I look at its population profile, its demographics, the structure of its mobility, let's say, a pandemic was seeded here, what would be the outcome, right? So that's a different kind of model asking a different question, but also relevant because it's saying that, how vulnerable are systems to the spread of these kinds of diseases, right? And, different models, different questions, but all worthy outcomes, right? So it's just in support of your observation.
More of a comment than a question. I like that. Yes, but so we're already coming up on the hour. Time flies by. So I want to ask a little bit also, just coming back to the gossip part. I remember, when you write rebuttals for big general interest journals, you write, what a great comment by the reviewer. You try and accommodate the reviewer. I also remember once reviewing for Nature, or not Nature, PRL. And I remember making some comment where I wasn't 100% sure, and I tried to somehow express my doubt and say, what is this, like this or like this, or maybe it's a good idea that it was more clear. And then the author just answered back like, this is the stupidest question I've ever received, reviewers clear an idiot. And all of the answers were like that, like super aggressive. And I remember that, like physics reviewing, and especially PRL, is kind of a different vibe than let's say general interest journals. So did people love this stuff? How did it fare in peer review? Are there any good stories there?
Yeah, we managed to dig up the review report. So actually the whole process was pretty fast. It's like 6 weeks to be accepted. And there was only one reviewer who was very kind of nice and lenient and like chilled
Fantastic.
out. But the editor was bitching about is this physics kind of thing?
Yes.
So that, I mean, most of the reply was about that. We wrote a kind of nice essay there.
Yeah, I think it was a passive aggressive complaint to the editor, I think, and it worked. So,
but this was a big deal then.
I think this, it was like right after the kind of like boom of network science. So PRL got like tons of network papers, and they tried to cut down on that.
Yeah, I remember, and there was, I mean, I remember back in 2003 trying to just put a paper in PRE, and there was a lot of, is this physics? And then we had to add a lot of network science papers in PRE to the list of references to convince them that it was a physics topic, because there are so many networks papers already in PRE. And then once we're done, then we had to take them out again because the referees thought that there were way too many references. But it was a big thing before. There were kind of journals for what we do. Just getting them in the physics journals was kind of difficult.
Yeah, especially at that time, right? I mean, I guess my case, I think when I was in grad school, I was mostly publishing in PRE, you know, the odd PRL and the European Physical Journal B, right? So
good old European Physical Journal B, classic.
Yeah, EPJV. I have fondness for that journal. There's also Physica A, right? That's another good one.
That's a classic, yes.
That's a classic as well. So things are a little bit different now, right? I think it's a lot more accepted and it's become more mainstream. And I guess now it's more challenging to publish in like, you know, PNAS and Nature's billion journals that they have, and those other ones, right?
But it is slower now. That's a bit frustrating.
A lot slower, yeah. Because I remember, you're right, because I remember like from conceptualization, execution to publication was about 3 to 4 months, at least during my school days.
I mean, the review process are probably the shortest in the history of mankind, around 2005.
Yeah.
Like before, at that time, people, like old professors, used to complain, like, I mean, they used to say it's so easy these days, like you don't have to send out like paper copies for review. Like communicate by a snail mail.
Yeah, you could. I remember you could send your proofs back by fax. That was also a thing, right?
Yeah.
Or floppy, right?
Yeah.
that's even before my time, the floppy disk thing.
That is true.
Yeah.
So this is but
I'm just curious to hear from you guys. What is your experience over now, like this year, in terms of your peer review experience, the amount of time it takes and stuff like that? I've certainly noticed over this last year, things have slowed down substantially, sort of.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's a gradual trend. I mean, I felt it was worse a few years ago, but probably not. I mean, it's not that kind of big N.
But don't you think, my thought is that right when you talk about it, Peter, it's like email has come, the transportation of the paper is eliminated, people can answer quickly, but people haven't started wasting huge amounts of time answering other emails and being on Twitter. So it was so fast right around there because they had all the advantages of email, but they hadn't kind of lived with the consequences with what it does to the human brain. So now we're kind of if we weren't constantly doing stupid podcasts or being on Twitter and answering an infinite number of admin emails, because then we could also review way faster. Is that a good point? That's my unified theory.
There was a sweet spot of the early days of email when academic publishing was at its most efficient. So there you go. This ties back to our paper, right? So there was an optimal situation for a brief period, and then there were consequences, and then optimal situation is not optimal anymore. So
well, hopefully there's going to be an enormous reshuffle of everything, a phase transition, and we're going to come back to fast reviews or something.
Fast reviews and mechanistic models.
Yes, exactly. That's what we need.
Yes. We must plug mechanistic models.
I feel like I should have episode titles that's more like that. Fast reviews and mechanistic models. That's a good episode title right there. But
right.
but really good. But I mean, we're coming up. We're already past the hour. It is so great to see both of you. It is great to hear about a classic paper. So is there anything I forgot to ask, or should we just wrap it up? Say, get Petter to bed. What is it midnight now?
Yeah, Petter is dying. Yeah. I'll just make another observation. I just found that the poster behind your right shoulder seems to be a Tintin poster, Destination Moon, right? Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. Oh, hang on.
So I have similar posters in my room as well. So there's a nice connection there. So
that spaceship is the coolest looking spaceship ever drawn. It looks like a spaceship should look. It's so elegant and it's a fantastic one.
Here is one there. So that's the Castafiore Emerald.
Ah, very nice.
Yeah.
Right. So
fantastic.
I don't have it.
God damn it, Petter. You get some posters.
Sorry. Yeah.
All right, really good. So
I mean, this has been great. I just have to thank you for inviting us.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's great to see all of you. We are all old friends, and
yes,
it's a very strange circumstance, but at least the miracle of modern technology,
at least this is also an excuse to just talk, right? Like, I can't wait till we can go to a conference, see each other, have a beer, and do more of this.
Yep.
But at least now
that's something that we're all missing, I think. Hopefully soon. Yeah.
Right. Really good. Thank you for coming, and talk to you guys both soon. Take care. Bye bye.
All right. Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.